When it comes to music production, having a good workflow is about getting from point A to Z as quickly and effectively as possible. And if you've been producing music for a while, you probably know how easy it is to develop bad workflow habits. And if you're a beginner producer and you haven't had a chance to develop any bad habits yet, you're definitely going to want to watch this video, because trying to break a bad habit is a lot harder than just developing good habits to begin with. But why should you even care about having a good workflow in the first place? And well, by the end of this video, I'm going to share with you a true story that happened to me that really illustrates why having a good workflow is so important. And that's why I want to share with you 3 terrible workflow habits I used to have and how I fixed them. Now, personally, I use FL Studio, and while this video is geared towards FL Studio users, the workflow habits that I'll be talking about in this video are universal to any DAW you might be using. Also, within FL Studio, there are a lot of different ways to do things. And as far as I'm concerned, there's not really a right or a wrong way to do things, but there usually is a faster and possibly better way to do things. So I hope you can watch this video and really use these tips and think about ways that you can potentially speed up your own workflow as well. And with all that being said, let's get straight into it. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I made when I first started producing was not using any keyboard shortcuts. And this bad habit actually stayed with me for way too long, because what I ended up doing is basically using my mouse to do everything inside FL Studio. And over a long enough time frame, this can add a ridiculous amount of extra time that you're unnecessarily spending inside FL Studio. So if you open FL Studio, you can hit F1 and it will open the FL Studio manual. This thing is huge and can potentially answer pretty much any question you might have. However, another thing it has is all the shortcuts you could ever need to know. So I can just type in shortcuts in the search bar here and then click keyboard and mouse shortcuts, and it will show you all of the shortcuts you could ever need. However, this can be a little overwhelming and you probably don't need to learn all of them. So I made a Google document with a list of the most important keyboard shortcuts that I think you should learn in order to speed up your workflow. I'll leave a link to that document in the description of this video. However, one of the shortcuts that I highly recommend you start getting in the habit of using is Control S. This will save your project, and I personally hit Control S pretty much anytime I do anything in FL Studio. That way, if FL Studio crashes for some reason, I don't have to worry about losing any progress. Now, another feature that FL Studio has is the ability to automatically back up your projects for you. And by default, this should already be enabled and will probably be set to every 10 minutes. If you want to change this, you can go up to Options, then File Settings, and at the very top, you can change this from 10 minutes to as low as every 1 minute. And it will even save before it does any sort of risky operations that can potentially cause FL Studio to crash. Anyway, even with this feature, I still think it's a good idea to save your projects as frequently as possible. A couple of other simple but important shortcuts to learn are spacebar to start and stop your track, and F5 through F9, which control the playlist, channel rack, piano roll, mixer, and browser. And when it comes to learning the rest of the shortcuts, the way that I broke this habit is by learning and incorporating one keyboard shortcut into my workflow at a time. This made things a lot easier for me because it's so much easier to incorporate one small change into a new routine than to try and incorporate like 30. Now, another bad habit I used to have is not having a clear vision about what my goal was for any given session I was doing. In other words, sometimes I would sit down and produce music with absolutely no idea what I wanted to accomplish, and writer's block or producer's block or whatever you want to call it would set in. And I would pretty much just waste a lot of time and not actually get anything done. And I think that to an extent, getting rid of writer's block comes naturally with experience. But what I did to consciously break this habit is a few things. First, I set a couple of parameters for myself so that no matter what, I would always have a productive session. And so basically I broke down my sessions into a few possible ways I could be productive. And then I went into each session with an idea of exactly what I was planning on getting done for that session. And if for whatever reason things went south and I wasn't feeling it, or I got producer's block or something, I always had a backup plan that I could pivot to and still be productive. So my sessions look something like this. I'm either going into a session with the intention of creating a new track or working on something I've already started. For me, this is what I enjoy the most, so it's the majority of my sessions. I also split mixing and mastering into separate sessions for a few different reasons, but the main reason is that you're going to have best results when you're listening to things with fresh ears. So this is another potential session I might plan on getting into, either a mixing session or a mastering session. And sometimes it can be multiple mixing sessions or multiple mastering sessions on the same track. It just kind of depends. Another potential session I might choose to do is a strictly sound design session. And this can be anything from messing around with synths, to creating synth presets, to making drum samples from scratch, or even putting together sample packs and just kind of organizing things in FL Studio. But this way I have a clear goal of exactly what I'm trying to get done, and if for some reason I go into a session and it's not working out, I can pivot and go into a sound design session and still get stuff done. The other mistake that I made for way too long is not creating a custom template for myself. But before we get into that, I do want to mention that I do offer one-on-one private lessons, which you can sign up for on my website at anothermonsterproductions.com. So if you're a beginner producer or you're struggling with anything production related, feel free to check that out. I'll leave a link in the description. The other mistake that I made for way too long is not creating a custom template for myself. And this one actually solves several potential workflow issues. And one big issue that it solved for me is organization. The good thing about creating your own custom template is that you can make it in a way that complements your own personal workflow. And so how I fixed this particular habit was by making myself a custom template and then tweaking it over time to try and optimize it as much as possible. And the first custom template that I made for myself only had a few metering plugins on the master channel, and that was pretty much it. I realized that I was loading the same metering plugins every single time that I started a project. And when I finally realized how much time I was wasting by doing this, I eventually made myself a custom template. However, even with this first custom template, I was horrible about labeling and coloring things in the playlist and the mixer. And I know from teaching a lot of lesson students over the past several years that this is something that a lot of producers are guilty of. There are quite a few reasons why organization is so important. And I'll tell you a quick story from personal experience as to why I ultimately decided to redo my custom template to include labeling. So back a few years ago, I was producing music for several artists around the Atlanta area. And one of the artists I was working with went on to start doing live shows. And so months and even years after we worked on a particular project, he would ask me for a different version of the project for different live performances. And I'd have to go back into my session and try and get him what he wanted. But the problem was that I had done a horrible job of organizing things and nothing was labeled. So what should have taken me about 10 minutes sometimes ended up taking me a couple hours to get done. And after doing this a few times and being extremely frustrated with myself, I finally decided it was time to update my custom template again. And this time I finally color coded and labeled everything in the playlist, but I set it up in a way where it still wasn't really fully optimized for speed. It wasn't until a couple years ago that I eventually set up a new template and tweaked my workflow a bit to try and save even more time. And that particular template is pretty much the same template that I'm currently using now. I think I might have changed a few things on the mastering chain, but if you want to see exactly how I put together that template and hear more about my workflow and my thought process of how I like to work inside FL Studio to try to get from point A to Z as quickly as possible, click the video on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.